20 and welcome to the second video on ecosystems and interactions where we're really going to focus in on biotic factors. So today, what are you learning? You're looking at both the biotic and abiotic characteristics within both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems and learning how these limiting factors influence the organism's distribution and range, essentially where they live and how far they move. The success criteria. You have to be able to define abiotic and biotic. You have to be able to take those terms and use it when describing what a limiting factor is. If you're forgetting what a limiting factor is, we learned about it in our vocab a couple lessons ago. Go back and refresh your memory. You also need to explain how competition is considered a biotic factor. You have to describe a predator-prey relationship and how it is also a biotic factor for limiting populations. And then really look at the differences and list the differences of abiotic factors in different ecosystems. So let's start off in the world of predation. Predation just means predator-prey relationship, essentially. So here you can see the fox carrying away the rabbit. Predation is what we would call a limiting factor that is biotic because they're both living organisms. Okay, so a biotic factor that limits populations. And how do I know that this is happening? Is essentially, if you look, we can graph what we call a predator-prey relationship. This shows the population density over time. So what you're seeing is as the prey, so the smaller animal, increases in size and reproduces, okay, their numbers get larger. And as their numbers get larger, you'll notice slowly the predator's numbers at first will drop because there's not enough food. But then as these numbers increase, their numbers will start to increase because there's enough food to eat. This is key because this increase of the predators puts pressure on the prey, meaning if you have a lot of prey, you're going to eventually have enough predators to eat that prey. And it keeps that prey's population from going way too high. So the predator's population follows shortly after, peaking, because now that it's peaked here, you'll notice, look at how low our prey numbers are. And that's because we're influencing the population to decrease because we're eating the prey. And eventually it might drop pretty low, but you'll notice so does the predators' numbers. And that is how we keep predators from being too high in a population. We limit them by removing their food source or removing a biotic factor. So this comes down until it's low, but again, without a lot of predators, our prey can increase. So it's showing you that we limit the amount of populations using the influence of the predator-prey relationship. You're going to look at this a little bit more closely as you do an activity later on. The activity is called the predator-prey relationship activity. It's going to use a graph much like this. Actually, I'm pretty sure this is the graph. And you're going to answer a bunch of these questions. Now, I'm not going to get into these questions right now because I've created a document in which you can do this on. But essentially, you're going to be looking at the influences of the lynx and the hare. Another form of biotic limiting factors is called competition. So let's dive into what competition is. You have interspecific and intraspecific. You'll see that the difference is the E and the A. Now, in the world of competition, when members of the same species compete for a resource, we call that intraspecific. Think intramurals at school. When two classes play dodgeball against each other, intramurals, because it's humans competing against humans. Okay, so that's very much this picture right here. These two kangaroos are fighting for territory, same species competing for resources. They're fighting for mates, they're fighting for territory. That's resources. The other type of competition is called interspecific competition, in which we look at two different populations of two different species populations, so the zebra and the wildebeest. This would be considered a community, right? Two different species interacting, but they're also competing for resources, water, for example, here. So how competition helps keep numbers down is when you have to compete for resources, your population can't get too big because you have to share those resources with other animals. Otherwise, you will lose those resources and die. So the word international, if you're having troubles, remember these. International, think of lots of different communities, lots of different populations, lots of different things. International, different species competing. Intra means within the same. So there's a bunch of videos you're going to watch on your own that talks about the different types of competition, both inter and intraspecific. Watching these will give you an idea of both the differences between the two, but think, how are these competitions limiting populations within an aquatic ecosystem, a terrestrial ecosystem, between different species, or within the same species? So again, thinking about how are we making sure that population sizes are not getting out of control so that certain populations don't die off. The last thing we want to talk about is abiotic factors within an ecosystem. So again, two different types of ecosystems, terrestrial and aquatic. Looking at them, remember terrestrial means on land. So when we think of land, you have to think of soil composition. So has the soil got lots of nutrients? Is it really rocky? Does it have a ton of clay? Is it really silty? Is it really sandy? Those are all things that are abiotic factors that are going to affect how plants grow. Sunlight. Do I have direct sunlight, lots of sunlight, less sunlight? Sunlight is going to have a huge impact on what grows in that ecosystem. Air quality, water quality, things like how much oxygen is in the water, the pH level, the phosphates, the nitrates, sedimentation, meaning how much dirt is mixed in, turbidity, is it really moving really fast or moving slow? All of these things are going to have an effect on what can grow in that area and what can live off of the water or what can live with the air quality. And last but not least is the temperature. If you took a penguin and threw a penguin in at the equator, you're going to kill the penguin. The penguin can't live in hot weather. It is adapted to cold weather. So temperature is another factor that we have to look at when it's about talking about abiotic factors in an ecosystem. All of these can have limiting abilities on different populations. In an aquatic ecosystem, we have to remember we're underwater, so not all sunlight will penetrate. So you have the sunlight that does penetrate to like for example, a coral reef. But then if you think of deep, deep water, there's a really huge lack of sunlight. How do animals actually get their food when there's no sunlight? And we're going to talk about chemosynthesis later. You have to remember salt water is a big part because you have oceans and you have fresh water. Can you live in fresh water or can you live in salt water? Some animals have adapted to live in both, which is really unique. pH levels, for example, are also going to have a huge effect. If you're dumping chemicals into the ocean, how does that affect what lives there? Exposure to air. So you have to remember animals don't breathe the air outside of the water. There's oxygen in the water they have to breathe. What happens when that water becomes hypoxic or hypoxia, meaning lack of oxygen, or has oxidative stresses on it, meaning it can no longer produce oxygen for those animals? What happens then? You also have extreme temperatures. Okay, volcanoes erupt underneath the ocean all the time. Islands are because of massive eruptions in the bottom of the ocean. Those eruptions create extreme temperature fluctuations. How do animals survive if there's extreme temperature fluctuations? You also have to remember in the ocean, there's currents, turbulence, and pressure that are all part of this. These are all things that will affect organisms that will have an effect on their populations. So please make sure you have both of these in your notes and understand what an abiotic factor is, because they are very different than biotic factors. Biotic factors are living things causing each other to have pressures to keep their populations low. Abiotic factors are non-living things that are causing pressures that keep populations smaller. So if you have any questions, please let me know.